people of Reddit who have met a celebrity. Which one? And how was the experience? I met Ashton Kutcher and Demi Moore when they were married, when they rented a nearby house for the Super Bowl in town. I was super young and a bunch of us rode our bikes to see them. He made a point of walking out to hug and take pictures with everyone and was all around a super charming guy. She was a little more standoffish but still sweet. He drove around the neighborhood a few times the days before and would always smile and wave to everyone. My dad and I went to a con for my 16th birthday. As we are just walking around we see this guy in a really good Jack Sparrow costume, so we ask if we can snap a photo and he says of course. So I stand next to him and my dad snaps the photo. A few months after the con he's talking to one of his co-workers and shows him the photo. Apparently I got a photo unknowingly with Johnny Depp, who's known to go to small cons in full costume. My experience with him was great. He was super kind and chill. I worked at a coffee shop when I was younger, a Starbucks inside a gigantic Chapters store. Robin Williams came in while I was working and I took his order and made his coffee. I was completely starstruck. He was my favorite movie star when I was a kid. I didn't have much of an interaction with him. He was courteous, but just after a coffee and something to read. What really struck me was that there were maybe 60 or 70 other people getting coffee or looking at books, and every single one of them was staring at him the entire time he was there. People talk about the price of fame, and it always sounded like horse shit to me, but after that I totally believe it. Imagine never being able to go and do anything without everyone who saw you knowing who you were, and, for them, any interaction you have becomes a story they remember. It's fucked up. My dad wrote a book called Horse Soldiers. It was adapted into a movie called 12 Strong. My family got to go the premiere in New York City, and I got to meet Chris Hemsworth, Michael Shannon, and Rob Riggle. I also got to meet Matt Damon, because he was also just watching the premiere. My family got to meet Chris and my grandma dropped her bag and Chris picked it up. My grandma looked at him with pure adoration in her eyes. Later, after discovering that Chris Hemsworth's wife is several years older than him, exclaimed, now that I know he's into older women I might have a chance. I met Tom Holland. I was his Uber driver. I geeked out for a second, initially. He kind of popped out of nowhere. Even if it was a non-celebrity, I would have been startled. But since it was him I was startled and blurred out, "You're Spider-Man," like a fucking idiot. He responded with, "No I'm not," and proceeded to ask about my day. Super nice. We talked for a bit, and the rest of the ride we both enjoyed our own music. He put his AirPods in, and I with my car speakers. Luckily, I didn't freak him out too much, because he left a nice tip through the app. At Warped Tour 99 I met Eminem, before he got famous, and I had no idea who he was. I accidentally kicked a rock into the back of his shoe, and when he turned around I started to apologize, and he immediately began yelling and calling me a bitch. A few minutes later my friends and I were waiting for a band to start on one stage, but the performer on the stage next to us was getting booed by everyone. So we look over, and I'm like, oh hey, it's that guy who called me a bitch. Boo. Anyway, he got booed off the stage in his hometown of Detroit. A few months later he was all over MTV and music magazines, and then everyone knew who he was. I met Dave Chappelle a few years ago. Got to talk to him for about 20 minutes. He was really down to earth, and just naturally funny and enjoyable to speak with. My dad worked on Equus when Daniel Radcliffe starred in it. He got me a ticket to the Christmas Eve show, and afterwards I was brought backstage with the cast and crew for a little party in one of the dressing rooms. As I was walking into the dressing room, Daniel was just standing in the doorway and said something like, "Pardon me," so I could get in, like he was in my way. I remember turning bright red and telling him he was fantastic, and he shook my hand and thanked me for coming. He was so genuine and chill. My dad, who was a part of the crew, got to interact with him pretty frequently, enough to have little inside jokes even, and he also said he was one of the most down to earth people he'd ever met. All in all, a really cool guy and a phenomenal actor. Side note, this was the play that required his character to be completely naked at one point. I remember how surreal it was to shake the hand of someone I'd seen in all of the Harry Potter movies growing up, and thinking, wow, I just saw your penis and now we are in a doorway shaking hands and my god you are lovely. At a hotel I worked at as a valet, I got to meet Post Malone, who was dining at the steakhouse connected to hotel. He pulled up in his custom Rolls Royce with a white Suburban in tow with his guests and security. The coolest part of this story, other than being able to drive his car, was when he came outside for a smoke. He was by himself and we got to small talk for a good 5 minutes. The convo ranged from where we both grew up to what we like to do in our free time. He was a really cool, down to earth guy. PS, before anyone asks, no, he did not smell. I've told this story before. I've met a lot of famous people. Used to be a waiter in Napa Valley. The one that left the biggest impression on me though was when I was 6 years old. John Wayne. I had just gotten a double mastoidectomy and was roomed with another kid my age at the Ucla Children's Hospital. About 4 hours after surgery, I woke up to this tall-ass man walking into my room. He walked over to the other kid, who was nonverbal and experiencing lung problems, and sat and talked to him for the next half hour to an hour. Then he got up, came over to me, and asked about the bandages covering my head. I then realized that he looked familiar. As I'm answering, in walks my grandmother. She does a double take and asks Mr. Wayne, "What are you doing here?" He smiled, held out his hand and says, "Hi, I'm John Wayne." My grandma's jaw dropped. She shook his hand and said, "I'm Ruby, Greg's grandmother." Mr. Wayne turns to me and says, "Hi Greg." Semicolon. Mr. Wayne then explains that the boy in the bed over is his grandson and that he was pretty ill. My grandma talks to him for a while. He smiles, turns to me and says, "Keep an eye on my grandson, okay Greg?" I just nodded my head and told him, "Okay." My grandma is on cloud 9 the rest of the night. She handed me this clear plastic-headed Mickey Mouse gumball machine and puts it on the nightstand next to me. Semicolon. The next day, Mr. Wayne walks into the room and says, "How are you doing Greg? How's my boy been?" I tell him my head hurts and that his grandson's being quiet. He pulls up a chair between our beds and asks me if I'd like to hear him read a story. I'm like, yeah. He spent the next hour or so reading us a couple stories from Grimm's fairy tales. I cut storytelling short by reaching for my Mickey Mouse gumball machine to get a gumball out and knocked it off the table. It shatters and gumballs are all over the floor. Mr. Wayne gets up and starts picking up all the stray gumballs. As he's picking up the shattered Mickey, in walks about 10 of my family members that my grandma had talked to. They were all shocked to see him standing there, holding my shattered Mickey. Semicolon. The next day, Mr. Wayne came in with a new Mickey Mouse gumball machine and told me that if his grandson woke up, I'd have to share them. I told him I would. Semicolon. For the duration of my stay, Mr. Wayne showed up every day to see his grandson and either sat to talk or read to him. He was a gentleman. Met Elton John backstage once. He was so businesslike that it was what I imagine it's like to meet the Queen. We were lucky enough to get backstage friends of Elton instead of friends of the band or press. So we had a lovely waiting room with free booze and snacks. We waited about 30 minutes till he was ready for us. Step 1. Stand in a line and shake hands with an individual comment for each person. Step 2. Ask for cameras and hand them to assistant. Step 3. He puts his chubby arms around you and smiles for the photo. Assistant takes like 3 photos per camera. Step 4. He thanks you for coming and tells you to enjoy the show. Total time: 1 minute for a group of 8. I met Richard Simmons. He was on my flight to Venice. He was super friendly. Said he was going to buy hair dye for me because my son has red hair and he said we needed to match. Taylor Swift is known pretty well for her way she meets fans. I was at her 1989 tour. It was my first Taylor concert and she was performing Love Story where she just circles the building on her piano. I was so happy in that moment I started to cry. Next thing I know someone is tapping on my shoulder and I turn around and see her mom. She asked me how I was and I was crying and said I'm doing great. She asked who I was there with and was really shocked when I told her I was by myself. She was essentially mobbed then with people crowding her to give her stuff to give to Taylor. I thought we had finished talking until she grabbed my hands again and asked if I wanted to meet Taylor. After the concert a group of us who had all been invited to meet Taylor went backstage. There was a room set up with pizza, soda, themed cookies and a photo booth. They told us no selfies or videos and to wait our turn. Her mom came up to me and asked to take a picture with me, and her aunt came and introduced herself to me and talked. Taylor came out and talked to every single group for ages. She's truly a gem of a person. She wanted to hear everything you had to say and was always asking questions and truly listening. It was my 18th birthday and she wrote a note about it and made everyone sing to me lol. When she heard I came by herself, she made me promise not to leave until she found someone to walk me to my car. She ended up sending her head of security with me. Later I posted my picture on Tumblr. She must have seen it and followed me. 3 years later I went to see her in London and she saw on Tumblr and invited me backstage. She technically wasn't allowed to have people there, so she hid us in the hallway. Talked to me like we were old friends. Incredible through and through. In 2011, 1 year before she won a gold medal in boxing, I spared Claressa Shields. From what I remember, no one mentioned that she was going to the Olympics, just that she was very good. I only found out later when I watched the matches and am rather glad she took it easy on me. I saw Pete Davidson about a year ago walking around the streets of Nick. We stared at each other for a few seconds because I knew him from somewhere and he knew that I probably knew him too, and his facial expression was like, "Aren't you gonna say something? Don't you know who I am?" I said nothing because I normally don't like to be that guy. My brother saw Paul McCartney walking around Tribeca with like one other person in broad daylight. He said his hair was floating. Henry Winkler, the Fonz Drive. Saperstein is the nicest celebrity, of which I have only met a few of, that I have ever met. Nearly every year I go to Philly Comic Con with my dad. We had met other celebrities in previous years like Matt Smith and Stan Lee. During both of those occasions it was for a quick signature and that was it. Last year however, we were walking around and we see Henry Winkler sitting at his booth with no line. We walk past it thinking it was because he wasn't available yet, but we come back and see him talking to some people. So we ask the person at his booth how much things were. My dad buys a photo with him for not that much and we wait in the small line to get the picture. When we go to stand next to him, he is automatically very welcoming and we quickly mention what we liked him in, but he is willing to have a conversation. So we talk to Henry Winkler for at least 3 minutes before we run out of stuff to talk about. And then here's the kicker. He thanks us. Usually for photo ops you thank the celebrity and get out, but he thanked us and then shook our hands and said have a great day. Honestly, to this day I think about how nice he was. Now you might think that he was just being as courteous as you would expect anyone to be in public, but both the fact that it is not expected of him to be nice and the warmth with which he greeted us is something I'll never forget. I almost ran over Katie Holmes on my bike back when she was filming Dawson's Creek. She was tiny, it was pitch black, because they were filming down on the Sound. Could have happened to anyone. Anyway, I apologized profusely. Honestly, I thought it was a little kid, and she was actually pretty nice about it. I recognized her voice before I recognized her. I would have asked for a picture, but, you know, I almost mowed over her on a bike, so I figured we were square. I had gym class with Taylor Swift in high school. I was a senior, and she was a freshman. She was kind and goofy, uncoordinated and awkward as hell when it came to literally any sport we were doing. She'd just laugh at herself and have a good time. I remember not feeling well one day, so I hung back in the locker room when everyone ran out onto the court. She stayed with me. We weren't super close and tried to take my mind off of feeling sick by asking me to describe my prom dress to her lol, down to what jewelry I was going to wear. Weird strategy, but the gesture was nice. All the seniors liked her. She hung out with us a lot. When she dated Drew, she was just weird, nice and cool. Also, her surprised face is real. I snuck into a meet and greet with Weird Al Yankovic about 20 years ago. I was the only one without a camera or something for him to sign, and he seemed a little suspicious about that. I told him how much I appreciated his music, and he told me how much he appreciated me listening to it. Then we talked for a few minutes about my favorite song from the concert and what songs I'd like to have seen him perform. Super nice guy, and didn't make me feel like just another annoying fan obligation. He seemed genuinely interested in our conversation. I met Mac Miller a few years ago. It was a meet and greet, but I got there dumb early and was the first to meet him, so I got a little extra time to hang around him. He was so chill, exactly how you'd imagine. I barely remember what I said. He was my favorite rapper, still is. I feel lucky I got to meet him.